At the edge of the war zone, the Iron Meridian held position with its engines dimmed to near silence. No forward advance. No weapons hot. No transmission of any kind went out. Not a challenge. Not a warning. Not the standard military identification protocols that every other fleet had broadcast upon arrival, perhaps hoping that announcing themselves loudly enough might somehow change their fate. Nothing. The humans simply waited. On Vareth, 7, Yaira watched this and felt something she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it, and when she did, it surprised her. They know something the others didn't. The Masters sent a warning volley. It was calibrated, not their full force, but enough to vaporize a Vedel cruiser in under a second, enough to make the point unmistakable. Concentrated energy weapons carved through space and struck the human front line with devastating precision, and the observation station sensors flared with the impact readings. Every person in the room leaned forward. The light of the detonations faded. The human ships were still there. Shields had flared, a momentary blooming of light across their forward hulls, and then stabilized as though the attack had been a minor inconvenience, a gust of wind against a mountainside. No formation shift, no evasive maneuver, no response of any kind. That's not possible, the Vedel analyst whispered. He pulled up the energy readings from the impact and stared at them with the expression of someone who had just discovered that mathematics had stopped working. That volley should have destroyed 3 heavy warships. The yield alone. I see the same readings you do, Yaira said quietly. The Masters fired again, this time without restraint. The full arsenal of weapons that had ended civilizations brought to bear on a single target. Missiles that bent around point defense systems. Plasma bursts that could melt through a planet's upper crust. Coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm any conceivable shielding arrangement in the known galaxy. The human fleet absorbed it, not dramatically, not with blazing counterfire or heroic last-second maneuvers. The shields took the punishment, flared and held. When the barrage ended, the formation was unchanged. One ship near the rear adjusted its position by perhaps half a kilometer, and Yaira realized after a moment that it was simply maintaining optimal formation spacing, not reacting to damage. The war zone fell quiet again. Then a single human vessel separated from the formation. Just one. A mid-sized ship, not their largest, not their most heavily armed by the look of it. It moved forward slowly, weapons banks dark, projecting no aggressive signature whatsoever. It stopped at a position equidistant between the human fleet and the Masters' outer pickets. A broadcast opened on every channel simultaneously. The voice that came through was not what Yaira had expected. She had braced for triumphalism, for the kind of calculated aggression that military commanders deployed when they wanted to make a point. Instead, the voice was simply calm. A human woman, speaking clearly and without particular drama, as though delivering a weather report. This war zone is now under human protection. What you have done here ends today. Withdraw your forces. This offer will not be repeated. The Master's commander laughed. The sound carried across the open channel, sharp and deliberately contemptuous. Destroy them, he said. All of them. What happened next was difficult to describe, because human weapons, it turned out, did not behave the way weapons were supposed to behave. Hull panels across the Iron Meridian's fleet shifted and reconfigured in ways that the observation station's sensors tracked with mounting confusion. Hidden ports opened with geometric precision. The space around the fleet seemed to change in quality, a subtle bending of the local field that made distant readings slightly unreliable, as though the ships were subtly editing the physics of their immediate environment. Alien sensor arrays across the galaxy registered the phenomenon and flagged it as a calibration error. Because it had to be a calibration error. It wasn't. The human fleet fired. There were no bright beams of light, no dramatic arcs of plasma, none of the visual language of warfare that the galaxy had developed over millennia of conflict. What left the human ships were thin lines of something that the observation station's instruments recorded simply as unknown energy classification. Precise, unhurried, almost delicate in appearance. The first enemy ship's shields did not overload. They did not fail through the normal cascade of diminishing power and increasing pressure. They simply ceased to exist, as though the concept of shielding had been politely removed from the local reality. The ship lasted for seconds after that. then the one beside it, then 6 more simultaneously. The human targeting spread across the formation with coordination that implied not a fleet of separate ships sharing a tactical network, but a single vast organism that had decided to end the conversation. On Verith 7, the room had gone completely silent. Officers who had watched fleets die for 2 years stood motionless, watching something they had never seen before and would spend the rest of their lives trying to adequately describe. A battle where only one side was actually fighting. The Master's fleet broke. It was not a tactical withdrawal. It was panic, the ancient animal response to a threat that the brain recognizes before the mind can process it. Ships turned in every direction, firing wildly, desperate for any action that might interrupt the terrible certainty advancing toward them. Some moved to regroup, some broadcast surrender, some simply accelerated blindly in any direction that was not toward the human fleet. Human fire followed them with the patience of gravity, not to destroy, or not primarily. Ships were struck and disabled, their engines silenced, their weapons locked down, their crews left alive and adrift in the growing debris field. The lethality was controlled. The intent was not destruction but cessation. The Master's commander watched his fleet disintegrate with a specific horror of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world is being revised in real time. He had not feared an enemy in centuries. Fear had ceased to be a relevant sensation when you were the apex predator of an entire region of space. But what was happening on his tactical display was not combat. It was correction. "Activate the core weapon," he ordered, and his voice shook only slightly. In the observation station, an aide pulled up the intelligence file on the enemy's core weapon with trembling hands and read its specifications aloud in a voice that grew quieter with each line. It was ancient technology, older than any species currently in the galactic community, acquired through conquest from a civilization that had since been entirely erased. It had been used 3 times in recorded history. Each use had been catastrophic beyond meaningful quantification. Each time it had fired, a fleet had ceased to exist. The weapon charged. Even at Vera 7's distance, the sensors registered the energy spike like a scream. When it fired, the wave of destructive force that rushed toward the human fleet was visible to naked eye, a bruising purple-white surge of collapsing space that moved faster than anything had the right to move and struck the human formation with a violence that rattled the observation station's hull despite the distance involved. One human ship took the direct impact. Its shields went brilliant white, held for 2 seconds, and then went dark. The ship drifted. The Master's fleet erupted in something between celebration and desperate relief. The commander straightened. His hand steadied. He had wounded them. They bled. They were not gods after all, just a species that brought better weapons. And even better weapons could be overcome, given sufficient desperation and an ancient enough catastrophe. History would record this moment as the turning point, the proof that humanity could be stopped. He was still composing that thought when the drifting ship moved. A faint light spread across its hull, not the light of fire or explosion, but something more structured, more intentional. Geometric patterns of luminescence traced across the damaged sections as though the ship's surface was healing itself, as though the materials it was built from remembered their intended configuration and were simply returning to it. Power readings climbed. Engines reignited. The ship adjusted its heading, took its position back in formation, and was still again, as though nothing had happened, as though the most powerful weapon in the recorded history of galactic warfare had been a mild inconvenience. The silence that fell over the Master's fleet was complete. It was a silence of minds encountering an impossibility too large to process quickly. The human fleet began to move, not rushing. They had never rushed, but advancing with the deliberate finality of a tide coming in, every ship in perfect alignment. Weapons fully charged, the geometry of their formation tightened into something that was less a battle array and more a statement of intent. The space before them seemed to organize itself, to accept what was coming. A final message went out from a human fleet. One sentence, delivered in the same calm register as every other human communication in this engagement. This ends now. The Master's command ship attempted to jump. Its engines tore the fabric of local space, forcing an exit vector through the battle zone toward anywhere else in the universe. Human targeting systems, which had been tracking it through every maneuver the past hour, adjusted in fractions of a second. The jump failed, and then the human fleet delivered its verdict. Not in anger, not with the vicious, consuming rage that the galaxy had come to expect from the climax of a great battle. The furious expenditure of every remaining weapon, the screaming last charge of a wounded force seeking to ensure its enemy's destruction at any cost. The human fleet fired with the same precise, almost clinical calm that had characterized everything they had done here. Measured beams from multiple angles struck the command ship simultaneously, each strike calculated, each assigned to a specific system, as though the humans were not destroying the ship so much as carefully disassembling it. Shields collapsed, armor peeled away. The weapons banks of command ship tried to bring online died before they completed their charge cycle. With a flash that was somehow quieter than everything that had preceded it, the command ship broke apart and scattered into the dark. The war zone went still. In the silence that followed, the remaining enemy vessels made their choices. Some fled, some powered down completely and broadcast surrender signals in every language their communication arrays supported. A few fired blindly in the direction of the human fleet, not from any tactical calculation, but from pure animal despair, the last spasm of an organism that knows is lost but cannot yet accept stillness. The human fleet responded to all of it the same way. Fleeing ships were disabled rather than destroyed. Surrendering ships were left in place, their positions noted for later collection. The desperate last-shot vessels had their weapons locked before the shots could fully form. When it was truly over, when the last energy echo had faded and the debris had settled into its long, slow drift, observation station Verif, 7 was so quiet that Yaira could hear her own breathing. She had been watching this region of space for 2 years. She had watched 47 fleets die here. She had written memorial reports for species that had ceased to exist in this room of darkness. She had long since stopped expecting anything from the war zone except silence of the devouring kind. What she was looking at now was a different silence entirely. The human fleet held position across the zone's full width, a clean perimeter of watchful, motionless ships. From each vessel, small drones deployed, not weapons platforms, but rescue craft, moving through the debris field with careful intention, collecting the crews of disabled enemy ships, the survivors from wrecks that had drifted too long, treating the wounded of an enemy that had opened the engagement with a weapon capable of erasing civilizations. Yaira realized she was crying, and didn't know exactly when she had started. The broadcast that went out an hour later reached every inhabited system in the galaxy within 6 standard hours. It was not coded or restricted to military channels. It went out on open frequencies, accessible to civilian receivers, trading post relays, the private communication arrays of remote colony worlds. It found its way into the background signal traffic of every major civilization's communication network, quiet and persistent as starlight. A human commander appeared on the screen, a man with a weathered face and dark eyes that were tired in a way that people who have seen too much and chosen to keep going always look tired. He wore no medals. His uniform was plain. He spoke as though he were having a conversation, rather than making an announcement. "The war zone is secure," he said. "The entity that maintained it has been defeated. No more fleets will vanish here. Safe passage through this region will be guaranteed, and we will maintain that guarantee without condition." He paused. "Humanity did not come here to conquer. We came here because what was happening here was wrong, and we were capable of stopping it. And those two facts together left us without a reasonable alternative. Strength that is only ever turned inward is not strength. It is hoarding. We do not seek your gratitude or your submission. We ask only that you extend the same consideration to those weaker than yourself that you would want extended to you." Another pause. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that was not quite sadness, but adjacent to it. "You know what you've done. You know which fleets you sent here as offerings, hoping the war zone would consume your rivals before you had to face them. You know which species you've allowed to be erased because their disappearance was convenient. That ends. Not because we are threatening you, but because we are watching and we will not look away." The broadcast ended. In the weeks that followed, the war zone was renamed. No formal council voted on the new designation. It emerged organically, spreading through ship logs and navigational charts, and the casual conversation of spacers who had grown up afraid of the region and now found themselves uncertain how to relate to the fact that they no longer needed to be. The name appeared first in a trader's route manifest filed out of a small Polani colony, was picked up by a Croatian navigational authority as an unofficial waypoint designation, and from there propagated outward until it was everywhere. The human line, trade routes that had been dormant for centuries, reopened near it. Civilian transports that had taken 3-month detours to avoid the region began making direct runs, cutting their travel times dramatically, carrying goods and passengers and the ordinary business of living through space that had once been hungry. Human patrol vessels moved through the area in quiet rotation, their presence broadcasting not dominance but reliability, the comfort of knowing that something watchful stood between you and what waited in the dark. In council chambers across the galaxy, old plans were quietly shelved. Military appropriations for long-planned invasions were redirected. Diplomatic communiques were sent to species that hadn't received communication from their neighbors in decades. The mathematics of power in the galaxy was being hurriedly recalculated by every civilization that had been doing those calculations based on the assumption that the war zone would always exist to make certain ambitions feasible. Those ambitions were suddenly, quietly unworkable. On Vareth 7, Yaira wrote her final report on the war zone, the last one. She noted in the cover memo that would need to address ongoing losses. She wrote it carefully and honestly, including the parts that were difficult to write. The 47 fleets they had watched die, the species had failed to warn adequately, the calculations they had done and never acted on. She included, as an appendix, a list of every crew lost in the war zone over 3 centuries. It was a very long appendix. When she was done, she stood at the observation window for a long time and looked out at the space that had once been the fleet grave. A human patrol ship was visible at the edge of the sensor range, moving in its quiet elliptical arc. Beyond it, a civilian freighter was making the crossing that would once have been unthinkable, its running lights small and warm against the dark. She thought about what the human commander had said. Strength that is only ever turned inward is not strength. It is hoarding. She thought about 47 fleets and the civilizations that sent them and the long history of a galaxy that had organized itself around the premise that survival meant keeping your capability for yourself, investing them in walls and weapons and the maintenance of your own borders, trusting no one and offering nothing, because the universe was too vast and too dangerous to afford generosity. She thought about a damaged ship healing itself in the middle of a battle and returning to formation, as though the choice to continue had never been in question. Outside, the freighter finished its crossing and disappeared into the lanes beyond. The patrol ship continued its arc stars burned where they had always burned, indifferent to the business of species and empires and the long moral argument of civilization. But something had changed in the dark between them. The war zone was not hungry anymore, and across the galaxy, in the quiet way that true things spread, not through proclamations or conquest or the burning of old maps, but through the slow accumulation of ships that made it home and crews that lived to tell about it, a new understanding was being written into the fabric of what was possible. Humanity had not come to the fleet grave to win a battle. They had come because somewhere in the long, uncertain development of their young species, they had arrived at a conclusion that older civilizations had examined and set aside as impractical, as naive, as a luxury that the harsh geometry of the universe did not permit. The conclusion was simple. Power is not what you protect yourself with. Power is what you protect others with. And in the war zone, in the place that had once swallowed fleets whole and given nothing back, that simple, stubborn, ancient as childhood idea had proven to be the most devastating weapon in the history of the galaxy. The human line held. The stars continued to burn. And the dark, for the first time in 3 centuries, was just the dark. The war zone drifted in the deep dark between stars like a wound that refused to heal. It was a region where light seemed reluctant to travel, where signals frayed and died mid-transmission, swallowed by something that science had never quite managed to name. Navigational charts marked it in red. Diplomatic communiques referenced it only in hushed tones. And among the spacers who had spent their lives threading the lanes of the galaxy, it had earned a name that required no explanation: the Fleet Grave. The name was not poetic. It was a ledger, Over the course of 3 centuries, no fewer than 47 armadas had entered the region with full crews, loaded weapon banks, and the confidence of civilizations that had conquered entire star systems. None had come back. Not a single distress beacon, not a fragment of wreckage, not even a faint thermal echo of an engine cooling in the void. They entered, and then they were simply gone, as though space itself had quietly folded them away. The entity responsible for this silence was known across the galaxy only by the cold designation its victims had assigned it in their final transmissions. The Fleet Graves Masters. Ancient, ruthless, possessed of a patience that made geological time seem frantic. Their warships moved through the war zone like deep ocean predators, slow and deliberate, entirely unconcerned with urgency, because urgency implied the possibility of failure. They did not hurry. They did not negotiate. They watched the sensors for incoming signatures, and when fleets arrived, they erased them with the quiet efficiency of a bookkeeper striking a line through an old debt. Inside Observation Station Verith, 7, positioned at what its builders had calculated to be a safe distance from the war zone's outer boundary, 17 alien commanders from 11 different species sat around a curved display table, watching the live sensor feeds with the particular stillness of people who had long since stopped hoping for good news. The room smelled of anxiety. Different species expressed it differently. The Vethel officer in the far corner had gone almost entirely pale, his bioluminescent markings dimmed to almost nothing. The Crocian general to his left was perfectly motionless, which for her species indicated not calm but extreme, almost paralytic fear. An aide stood near the door with a data pad she had forgotten to read, her eyes fixed on display. The Adrini fleet entered the zone 4 hours ago, said Commander Yaira Souls, a tall Polani with silver-gray skin and the deeply tired eyes of someone who had been stationed at Verith. 7 for 2 years too long. She did not look up from the display. 43 vessels, Class 7 warships fully armed, with dedicated support frigates. And, someone asked, already knowing, their last signal was 11 minutes after entry. Yaira paused. Standard communications degradation, followed by nothing. A young Vedel analyst at the edge of the room, one of the newer arrivals, not yet broken in by the gravity of the posting, leaned forward. That's the 3rd fleet this cycle. The 4th, Yaira corrected gently. The room settled back into silence. On the main display, the war zone rotated slowly in a false color rendering, deep purples and blacks swirling at its heart where the master's formations dwelled. It was almost beautiful, if you didn't know what it meant. Then the display chimed. Not an alarm. Something quieter than that. A detection signal. Something new had emerged from hyperspace at the war zone's outer edge, and the system was still calculating its classification. Yaira straightened. The rendering shifted. What resolved on the display made the room go very still. A fleet, but not like any that had come before. The formation alone communicated something different. Heavy warships positioned at the front in a layered chevron, not clustered defensively, but spread in a deliberate offensive geometry, each vessel precisely spaced to maximize field coverage without sacrificing mutual support. Smaller escort craft move at the flanks like quick water around slow stone, their patterns adaptive, intelligent, alive. Behind them, larger vessels whose designations the station's database couldn't yet classify held position in the rear, their silhouettes unlike anything in the Galactic Registry. The system finished its identification sweep. The label appeared at the bottom of the display in simple white text. Humanity Battle Fleet, designation, Iron Meridian. Someone in the room exhaled slowly. Somewhere else, a data pad clattered to the floor. Humans, the Crocian general said, in a tone that might have been wonder or pity or both. Yaira stared at the display. She had read the briefings on humanity, as had everyone in a position of galactic responsibility, a young species by any meaningful measure. Barely 4 centuries of interstellar travel, a single home system expanded into a modest cluster colonies. They had arrived on the galactic stage without ceremony, extending cautious diplomatic feelers and establishing trade relationships with pragmatic warmth that most older species found slightly puzzling. They were not conquerors. They had not, as far as anyone could determine, ever fought a war of aggression. Their military capability was considered moderate, respectable, perhaps, but hardly remarkable given how short their history was. What Yaira wondered what they doing here, across the war zone. In the deep black at its heart, the Masters had detected the new arrival. Their sensors were ancient and extraordinarily precise, and they had processed the human fleet's arrival within seconds of its emergence from hyperspace. The commander of the Masters' forces, a being whose species had no name for themselves because they had never encountered anyone capable of naming them, examined the readings with a Predator's calm assessment. He had destroyed Palani fleets, Croatian armadas, the legendary iron dreadnoughts of the Vedel Empire. He had watched species that had been spacefaring for millennia crumble in the face of his force's firepower. The war zone was his garden, and he tended it with the patient devotion of someone who understood that the garden was eternal. Humans, he knew of them dimly, a footnote in intercepted diplomatic traffic, a minor species that had wandered into the galactic community recently and caused no particular trouble. Young, inexperienced, almost certainly here out of some naive moral impulse, the kind of gesture that older species had long since been beaten out of. He showed his teeth, a gesture that served as a smile in his anatomy. "Another fleet enters a grave," he said to the second, his voice carrying particular comfort of complete certainty. "Prepare welcome." But then something stopped him. The human fleet had not moved.